guys, this is Jeff, Bookhouse Boy, back for the fifth and final haul from my 2 years away in New Zealand. I don't have an unboxing at all. All of these books I purchased from local used secondhand bookstores when I was in New Zealand. So I just have them here collected to show you. It's a mystery bag. But there's good stuff inside. I'm going to start with Auckland. Auckland is at the northern tip of the North Island. So New Zealand is basically the South Island and the North Island. And year before last, I spent a few months working in Auckland, which is at the top of the North Island, and found a fantastic used bookstore there. Of course, it's, used bookstores are what I was looking for as I was wandering around on my one day off a week. And I found one there called the Hard to Find bookstore, which was it was a little bit funny to me, only because it's probably one of the biggest used bookstores I've been to, not in terms of the number of books. I mean, there's the Strand in New York, there's any number of giant used bookstores, I'm sure, but this was actually kind of this huge old mansion in a subdivision of Auckland called Eden Terrace. Beautiful area, and I could walk there. It was kind of like a 45-minute walk from my hotel, so perfect. And I guess the name is actually the legendary, hard to find but worth the effort, quality secondhand bookshop limited. It's this huge, amazing place. There's a downstairs, there's an upstairs. Like I said, it's an old mansion, so there's nooks and crannies and closets filled with books, weird little dead ends, kind of the big rooms, which I guess might have been the living room or the family room or the parlor of this old mansion, just stacked with amazing old books. And I bought a few there. A couple aren't in this haul because I'm going to show them as part of a different video. But this was a book that I found that I had never heard of before, Salamander by Thomas Wharton. I haven't even looked it up yet. I haven't read it yet. I just thought it was a very cool cover and spine, which is why I picked it up. But I decided to buy it because of the Quill and Quire little review on the back, which states, Wharton's first novel showed the magic that can happen when writing is treated as art. His new novel, Salamander, is more audacious, more wonder-filled. It is about making books. It is about why we read and what happens to the chain of our lives when we do. So that just sounded awesome to me. So that's Thomas Wharton, Salamander. And that will kind of wrap up Auckland. That was a chunk of time that I worked up there, and the Hard to Find bookstore was pretty much where I would hang out on my day off. But the vast majority of time I was in New Zealand, I was at the southern tip of the North Island, which is Wellington, which is the capital. And there were some fantastic bookstores in Wellington and then just outside of Wellington. There's a couple that are right in town. One is called RDB's Books, and it's a good-sized bookstore, really, really pleasant folks inside, and a good selection of books. Most of the used bookstores that I would find had a big selection of books dealing with New Zealand, and they did a beautiful, fantastic whole area dedicated to classics. Not a lot dedicated to horror, kind of one bookshelf, and most of it was contemporary horror and nothing I had really heard of before or seen before. But there were a couple of things that I found there. Actually, I should say. So one was this tiny little Penguin Classics book, just stuck in between stacks of other huge books. M.R. James, Canon Alberic's scrapbook. I knew nothing about it, but it was $4 and marked for the horror section. $4 in New Zealand, so it was however much that was. $2.75 or something like that. But anyways, I had never heard of M.R. James. I had never heard of this book. I purchased it, and I'm going to be talking about M.R. James and his books in a big vintage horror video that I'm going to be doing soon, because he's so amazing. He has become one of my favorite writers of all time. And I won't go into detail because I'm going to get into detail in that video, but this was like the door opening to a whole world of vintage horror that I really didn't know existed. I knew a little bit about it, but not a lot, and I was floored by how spectacular these stories were. So that was one thing from RDB's books. The other one was just a fun older copy of A Room with a View, and it's nothing special. It's not a first edition. There's no book, no dust jacket. It was $3, so $3 New Zealand. Less than $2. But just a cool old version. I'd seen the movie, which is fantastic, and beautiful score, of course, but I'd actually never read it, and so for less than a couple of bucks was able to pick up a really sweet little vintage copy. So that's RDB's books, right in the heart of Wellington, and a fantastic place. I would stop there pretty much every time I had a day off. Even if I didn't buy anything, it was great just to mosey around and check it out. And there are a few smaller used bookstores. One of them is called The Ferret. A number of other ones, not to slam them by not mentioning them, but I never really found anything there. But there is another one that's great. So there's a big pedestrian street in Wellington called Cuba. And I can remember walking down Cuba Street and seeing kind of a sign for Pegasus Books and an arrow pointing to an alley off the street, which I followed. I went down this alley, and there it was, this awesome big used bookstore, and really nice folks running that one as well. And same deal, I go in there every chance I got. And I was able to find this really cool old book, The Connoisseur by Walter de la Mare. Now, if you saw my last unboxing, and I'll post, I'm not sure where that little flag shows up, but I'll post a link to it. I also bought online Two Tales by Walter de la Mare, which was a signed, numbered, beautiful vintage copy that included The Connoisseur, but this little guy, published by W. Collins and Sons, Glasgow, Sydney, and Auckland. Just a really neat little copy, The Connoisseur and Other Stories, so it's got some other stuff in there as well. Disillusioned, Missing, Mr. Kemp. But just a neat, tiny little thing to tag along somewhere, and easy to travel with, and beautiful, and horror. I haven't read it yet, but I'm excited about reading it. From what I understand, it's some cool writing. But again, I will get into that in the vintage horror video, which is to come. A friend of mine, a New Zealand buddy, recommended a bookstore to me that was not long. It was maybe a 20-minute drive outside of Auckland, called House of Books. and it's in a area called Lower Hutt. There's Upper Hutt and Lower Hutt, just outside of downtown Wellington. So I drove out there, tiny little bookstore. This one was not huge. Some really cool stuff, and of course I was looking for horror. Not a lot, couldn't really find anything. And then, you know, it always pays to rummage, whether you're in a bookstore or an antique store or a vintage store, pretty much anywhere. It pays to rummage, I've found. And so rummaging around these stacks of books, I found this little guy. Look at that. Weird Tales, Irish, with the most beautiful little cover, and the spine is just freaking insane. Look at that. Weird Tales Irish with a little crescent moon and a bat, and then beneath that I can get the spires of some little I don't know, some little mausoleum or something, I guess. So this tiny little book, just like this little treasure, and I'm assuming that these are just classic Irish ghost stories. The Lots Upon the Raft, A Night in a Haunted House, The Burial of O'Grady, I'm going to mispronounce this horribly, the Lionhan She, The Banshee, A Terrible Night. That sums it up. A Terrible Night. So good stuff for a rainy night in this tiny little book. You know, purchased from House of Books for a few bucks. And it looks like it might be part of a series. Maybe there's Weird Tales British and Weird Tales Scottish and other good stuff like that. But I haven't found any. I haven't really had a chance to look yet. But if you guys have ever heard of this or seen this before, let me know. All right, last stop. So on one of my last days off before coming back home, I drove a little bit farther north out of Wellington. I drove up the coast a couple of hours, and I was looking for a couple of vintage stores that I had found online. And funny story, actually both of them had closed down. I love New Zealand. I love Wellington. It's a beautiful country. It's a beautiful city. They're not necessarily as focused on maintaining their websites as a lot of folks in the U.S. are, and so the trek to vintage stores was a great big fail. They had both closed down long ago, abandoned, and well, one of them was abandoned and emptied out, and the other one had turned into, I think, a falafel shop. Maybe I think it was a falafel shop. But anyways, the day was still a huge success in my book because, see what I did there? Because driving out towards this area, I was on State Highway 1 heading north, and the directions to get to this town where these two vintage stores were basically just said take Highway 1. I think it was then turn left onto State Highway 3. So as I was doing that, there on the corner of State Highway 1 and State Highway 3, this big old used bookstore, and it was called the Ministry of Books. Awesome name. So I kept going, had a big fat failure, or I should say I kept going towards my intended destination, which were these two antique vintage stores, which seemed cool. The website still existed, stores didn't exist anymore, but grabbed something to eat, drove back, and of course stopped at Ministry of Books. And I had a feeling that it was going to be a success. My vibe was that it was going to be a good day, because when I turned back from Highway 3 onto Highway 1 to park, I realized that at that intersection, Highway 1 technically becomes Cemetery Road, I think it's called. Presumably, if you continue down that road, you end up at a cemetery. But I thought, oh, that's cool. So, huge old place. Lovely, lovely older lady behind the counter. The kind of place that, you know, just had stacks of huge old books covered in dust and cobwebs. You could spend days in here. I could have spent days in there having a good time, but just going through everything and trying to find treasures. But I did find a couple of awesome things. So this, oh yeah, I also got a bookmark. It's so sweet. The bookmark says, "An appreciation from the Ministry of Books, the best second-hand bookshop in New Zealand, State Highway 1, Sanson, Manawatu, New Zealand." They don't have a website, but that's okay. I'll go back if I ever get the chance. I found this beautiful baby, The Secret Panel by Annie S. Swan. And, you know, gorgeous spine. I saw it just shoved in between a bunch of other books on a shelf somewhere. Really cool design work with this kind of plaque around the title, which is in gold. There are some beautiful illustrations inside. Looking out, he saw that they had reached the gate. Yeah. So this was one of my purchases, The Secret Panel. And the final purchase, final book of the video. Again, I'm not going to go into detail because I'm going to save this for the vintage horror video, which is coming. And I don't think that this is rare by any stretch of the imagination, but I hadn't seen it before and it was so cool. Now imagine, if you will, I'm going through the stalls and I'm looking at the shelves, and then I see this spine poking out at me with a happy little Mr. Death, Grim Reaper dude, reaching out his arms. A century of creepy stories. Look at this guy. Look at this chunky guy. Look at that. A century of creepy stories. This would keep me going for a while. Yeah, Ministry of Books. I think this is from 1935. I don't know, that's what it says, but made and printed in Great Britain, the Hutchinson Printing Trust in London. And there's just a ton of stories in here. And I won't go through the whole thing because, again, I'm gonna talk about it more in the vintage horror video that I want to do soon. But Arthur Machen, Oscar Cook, Elizabeth Bowen, Walter de la Mare is in here, Shane Leslie, J.M. Barrie, D.H. Lawrence, M.R. James is in here, C.H.B. Kitchen, Charles Dickens, pages and pages. I mean, writers I've heard of, H.G. Wells, Ambrose Bierce, writers I've never heard of, Algernon Blackwood is in here, but just tons. And, you know, for a few bucks, you can't beat it with a stick. I mean, just so amazing. So anyway, that's it. That's my little mini tour of the used bookstores in New Zealand. Certainly not all of them, but the ones that I got to visit, which I loved. And I hope you guys enjoyed this final New Zealand 2 years away book haul. I've got a slew of other videos coming. You know, you've heard me talk endlessly about my vintage horror one, which is coming up. There are some other really cool ones coming up as well that just, I somehow knocked it out of the park with some of these books. So I can't wait to share them with you guys. That's it for now. Jeff, Bookhouse Boy, hope you guys enjoyed the video. Talk to you soon. Bye.